Thanks, Faith. Thanks, Laura, for including our paper in the program. Cliff Holderness is my co-author, who is also here. We are really delighted to receive the prize. It's a really good recognition. We're happy about that, particularly from this conference, which is so focused on corporate governance. I enjoyed a lot the program so far, and it's so nice to see kind of very topical questions addressed. We will take you back, if you want, to some very fundamental issues. This paper will be about the distribution of voting rights to shareholders. And again, if you go back to kind of classical papers that study other distributions to shareholders, you can see papers, fundamental papers in the 70s about cash dividends, and hundreds of papers that follow up that use basically price changes and volume changes around distribution of dividends. And again, there is rich literature on that. There is also big literature on rights offerings, distribution of rights. This is going to be the paper that is focused on distribution of votes. If you think about right to vote, this is one of these three distributions. It's probably the most common one because most of companies have voting event every year. And if you think about corporate governance, voting is probably one of key ingredients in that. If we take out the right to vote from shareholders, the way we think about corporate governance, the way we think about agency problems will be dramatically different. Now, it would seem that studying distribution of this right to shareholders would be important. To our surprise, this is the first paper in the literature that looks at what happens when these voting rights are distributed. Particularly, we're going to ask what happens in terms of notifications, what investors are aware of this distribution, but we'll also ask what happens to outcomes, to stock prices, and to trading activity. Our key findings, which I'm going to slowly present soon, are going to suggest that it's actually not the case that all investors know when voting rights are distributed. We're going to show you some results that suggest that there is a selective notification of investors in our markets. Moreover, if you're someone who is trying to learn about the X vote date when actually the distribution happens, if you're trying to do it from publicly filed proxy statements, a typical situation is that you will not know it on time. You will actually become aware of X vote date only after it actually happens. So we're going to show that firms are very strategic, and then we're going to study what exchanges are doing. We're going to show that New York Stock Exchange actually requires companies to notify the exchange about the X vote record date, but New York Stock Exchange is very strategic in terms of how they pass that information to investors. First of all, they sell it, and of course, they sell it primarily to institutional investors. So for small investors, for small retail shareholders, it's very hard to get this information from that channel. When we look at outcomes, at price changes and trading volume, we're going to show you that there are big changes, especially when we would expect these changes to happen when voting events are consequential. We're going to see really interesting patterns on trading activity, but it will come in a few slides. I think our big picture conclusion is that the distribution of voting rights is a material event. The way it happens in the United States suggests several potential interesting questions to address. In particular, I'm going to talk about some implications for literature, but also for regulation in the US of this matter. So let me start from an example from DuPont proxy fight. I'm sure you're familiar with that proxy contest. You've seen it. I will focus now on what happened to the distribution of the voting rights. DuPont is one of largest chemical companies in the world. It's an old company with amazing history. In 2015, it was attacked by an activist, Niels Perls, who accumulated a substantial stake in the company and wanted several changes to take place. Management resisted, and this engagement basically very quickly transitioned into proxy contest. Triant announced that the fund is going to nominate 4 directors for election and require also several changes in bylaws. It was very intense fight. There was a lot of attention paid by dissident and the management to this event, and there was a lot of communication going on between company and activists and shareholders who were supposed to to vote. There was a lot of lobbying. So if you think about this event ex ante, this was expected to be a very close fight, which large consequences for valuation. What I'm going to show you now in this table, basically you see here 3 columns: the dates, the return in excess of the market, and then trading volume. Trading volume is not normalized. This is just the number of shares traded. What I'm emphasizing here in gray areas. First of all, you see that March 17 is the record date. Okay, this is the record date, and at that point it was T+3 settlement rule. So if you think about the way we academics think about the X vote date, it was March 12th. It was COM date, and then March 13 was the X date. Now you see there is a substantial increase in trading activity right after this shares go X vote. Prices dropped by more than 5% on March 16. Okay, so it looks like a lot of investors responded to this distribution of the of voting rights. Potentially even more interesting, you can see here that on March 6, New York Stock Exchange privately notified an investor who subscribed to their services about the upcoming record date. So at that point of time, on March 6, the broad population of shareholders didn't know when is the record date. But New York Stock Exchange, it's a self-regulated institution, they require companies to get this notification, and they privately communicated to subscribed investors. On that day, there was a substantial increase in trading activity. Trading volume more than doubled. It means that these investors who receive these notifications respond to that. They view that information as valuable. Now, when public became notified about this event, it happened only on March 23rd. This is when you first time can see in proxy statement what was the record date. And this is going to be a very typical scenario. You see here that this notification happened after the X date already passed. So if you want to change the way you kind of hold shares, it's basically too late by that time. This is the best example that we have. I think it's representative of many of the stylus facts that I'm going to show you now. What I'm going to do, I'm going to basically show you results based on a large sample of shareholder meetings. We cover a sample from 96 to 2018. We have more than 100,000 shareholder meetings. We know meeting date, meeting type, whether it's a contested, whether there is shareholder proposal. We know the record date, and we also know when was the first time that we can see a proxy filing that is revealing the record date. We're going to use that information as well. In addition to that, we purchased notification data from NYSE, and we're going to have that information for NYSE listed companies. So the first key result is the following. If you're trying to learn when is the record date, when is the X vote date from proxy statements, 91% of time, it's going to be too late for you to change your holdings of these securities. 91% of time, the initial proxy statement that reveals record date happens after X date already has passed. So you cannot do anything on that. This number is going to be a little bit different, lower. It's about 55% when we look at what we call non-regular meetings. In this case, 55%, it's a number that corresponds to cases when we have a shareholder proposal included in the proxy statement. But it looks like most of time, if you learn this information from public sources, it's going to be late. Does it matter? This is one summary statistic that I want you to see. If you look at the likelihood of proposal to fail to pass, shareholder proposal fail to pass, it is 45% when proxy filed on time, such that people can change their holdings of these securities. But if proxy filed late, the failure rate is 24%. So basically, we see here substantial change in the failure rate of the proposal based on when this proxy is filed. The failing rate is going to be much higher if proxy filing revealing the record date is filed on time. Basically, management here is trying to strategically probably approach some investors that are going to help them defeat the shareholder proposal. So one conclusion from this slide, the timing of this notification is consequential. And in the paper, we show additional evidence to support it. What happens with New York Stock Exchange? I already described to you that they basically require companies to notify about the exchange about the record date, and then they sell this information to investors. If you look at this table, we rank here groups by when these notifications happen. So in group 1, for example, New York Stock Exchange notifies investors first. Then we see a record date happening, and only after that, proxy filing reveals the record date. In group 2, exchange notifies subscribers, then the proxy date happens, filing reveals the record date, and then record date approaches. We see that in first 2 groups, which are the vast majority of cases, New York Stock Exchange basically creates informational advantage here by allowing investors who subscribe to their services to be first ones to basically be notified about this event. And if you want to try to get this information for proxy statements, you're going to be in much delay relative to that. What happens to prices? So here we show you 3-day cumulative normal returns from 2 days before the X date to the record date. We see here that the average price change is negative and significant, which suggests that if you want to trade in order to buy the voting right, it's going to be costly. So the price of a marginal vote is non-zero, it's positive. Very intuitively, we see that when we consider subsample with non-regular filings, where we include cases when shareholder proposals are included, when we include cases with proxy fights, the price change is substantially larger, suggesting that the price of vote is larger in these cases. Okay, now this is a trading activity result. 0 here is a record date, and we see that once we go after the record date, there is substantial surge in trading activity, and it happens only for non-regular filings. Most of time, again, when voting is not consequential, there is not much going on. But whenever important issues are involved, we see that there is a substantial change in behavior of investors. When stock goes ex vote, there is a surge in trading volume. Now, this result is important. I'm going to talk about it on my next slide. It suggests that some investors were holding these shares, not because they wanted to wait until the outcome of the proxy fight, for example. They held shares only because they wanted to vote, and they were willing to sell these shares even before outcome of the voting process was actually disclosed. So the last slide, last minute, I will just give you some implications. I think one of most interesting implications here is that this paper teaches us that we probably could do more on understanding the dynamics of corporate voting. If you know, we know that some of voting outcomes are probably decided by big 3 that we saw in the previous paper, but not all, right? Because if all voting events were decided by big institutions, we would find no results in our paper. Our findings suggest that there are investors who are entrepreneurial and strategic, who trade when they need to vote, and this is clearly supported by results. Now, the fact that some of these investors don't even wait to see how the fight is going to be resolved suggests that they potentially hold shares for private benefits purposes and not because they really want to see what happens to valuation of securities. There is a recent, this is the next paper on the program, recent literature that studies the relationship between trading and volume and voting here. I think our finding clearly suggests that we should ask ourselves how understanding of corporate governance changes if we basically end up in a situation in which most of investors don't know when they get the right to vote, okay? Notification of voting record date. Again, our paper indicates that management has a lot of power, a lot of influence in terms of when to disclose the record date. New York Stock Exchange is basically requiring companies to get that information and then sells it to investors. Now, I do want to mention that voting rights are different from dividend rights. even if I don't know when is dividend record date, I will receive the distribution, right? But if I don't want to vote, if I don't want to basically exercise my voting rights and I don't sell security before, I will lose that distribution. So the implications here are very different. Notification of voting X date is important. It's much more consequential than for dividends. Now, again, we basically see here situations in which exchanges sell material, as our evidence suggests, information to some investors, and we don't have equal access to that information, we as shareholders. Now, policy implication, this is the last sentence that I'm going to say. I think our paper asks whether this is the basically situation in which we strategically want to be, where we decided to end up, in which management has so much discretion about the notifications, in which some investors learn this information before others. And one reaction is probably, well, maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe it's impossible to have a situation in which everyone knows when is the distribution of the voting rights. And here, we want to bring up an example because it's a global conference and European corporate governance is involved. In EU, record dates must come at least 8 days after the filing of the proxy. So in EU, by definition, all shareholders are notified of the record date. And by definition, all shareholders are notified in advance. So all of them can change the way they hold securities based on that information. For some reason, which we discuss in the paper, probably historical reason that involve federal and state legal environment, the situation in the US is dramatically different. Thank you very much. We look forward to discussion.
Thank you, Slava. Our discussant is Michelle Lowry from Drexel University. Michelle, take it away.
Thanks, Faye. Okay, everybody can see my slide, hear me. Thank you, Faye, Laura, for inviting me to be the discussant, and Slava for a fun paper to read. So I'm gonna jump right into things here. So let me first go over the paper's main findings, and then I'll offer some comments. So to briefly summarize, and again, Slava did a great job, but the first punchline is just that the record date, and again, that's the date on which one must own the stock if you want to be able to vote, that is typically announced after the fact. So for example, on March 6th, the record date is announced on March 23rd. And that right there, it just seems odd, right? It seems counterintuitive. The authors then go on to suggest that this may reflect strategic behavior of management. Maybe they're trying to hide the record date in ways that might benefit themselves. Now, investors, they have the option to buy a package of information that includes this record date, but it's really expensive. And that's inconsistent with Reg FD, right? Why do some investors get access to information and not others? It seems like a problem. And then finally, around the record date, we observe a lot of action. So we see significant changes in trading volume, we see significant negative returns. Now, what's kind of puzzling about it is that we observe those patterns even when the record date doesn't appear to be publicly available, which seems a little bit odd. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Okay, so my comment number one is, does this reflect strategic behavior by management? So on the one hand, the authors start out the paper, they motivate it with these DuPont and AmTrust examples. And these examples really seem to suggest that it does in fact reflect strategic behavior. So if you think about a timeline, this is the timeline in both these examples. The record date happens, but it's not announced till after the fact. And then sometime after that, we have the annual meeting where voting occurs. In the AmTrust example, which Slava didn't talk about, but what happens is that the record date occurred, and then after the record date, Icahn buys a bunch of stock because he's trying to influence this going private transaction that AmTrust is attempting to do. And then he files a lawsuit saying, well, wait a minute, the record date already passed. I didn't know that. How could I have known? You're hiding information. So the allegation is that Icahn bought stock not knowing that the record date had already passed. The DuPont example is a little bit different. Here we observe large negative returns around the time of the record date. But again, as Slava discussed, only some investors knew this was the record date, and that's unfair under Reg FD. So those two examples, they do suggest that this is strategic behavior by management. But when we look at the broader evidence, there seems to be a little bit of doubt. So think about how things should work, one would hope. You would hope that the companies would announce the record date, and then the record date would occur, as in the EU, and then the annual meeting after that. And between the announcement of the record date and the actual record date, investors would have the opportunity to accumulate shares prior to the vote. What's a little bit puzzling is that this scenario is actually much more common in cases where management would have the strongest incentives to hide the information in special meetings and more contentious meetings. So if this was strategic behavior by management, I would have expected they would have been hiding the record date in these special meetings, not doing the opposite. But that being said, let's go back and look at the DuPont and AmTrust examples in a little bit more depth to see if we can get a little bit more intuition for what might be going on. I'm going to start with the DuPont case. So let's look at those negative returns. So the paper shows, and as Slava talked about, we have these large negative returns around the record date, even though only some investors knew this was the record date. And maybe that's because the NYSE reported it ahead of time. But another thing to look at is whether there was any other information around this same period of time. So the large negative returns are on March 16th and 17th. Okay, so the first thing I did was just go on to Edgar to look at the SEC filings. And we see some action here. So on near the market close on March 13th, so I've got sort of the snapshot of returns up here. March 13th was a Friday. The large negative returns are Monday and Tuesday. So about 20 minutes before the market closed on Friday, we have a letter filed by DuPont to the activist saying, after thorough consideration, it's the unanimous conclusion of the board that the proposal does not represent a meaningful step towards a constructive resolution. In other words, this company is fighting back. After the market closed on that same Friday, we have the preliminary proxy statement that's filed by the activist, by Trion. Again, clearly a material piece of information. And consistent with that, I just did a Google search, DuPont proxy over these days around these negative returns, and 4 out of 4 of the articles that come up top on Google have to do with these, proxy filings. Okay, what about AmTrust? Let's look at that one in a little bit more depth. So here, if you recall, the record date occurred on April 5th, and then Icahn buys stock after that, and then files a lawsuit at some period of time saying, well, wait a minute, the record date already passed. There's no way I could have known that. You weren't disclosing that fact. So would Icahn really have been surprised that the true record date was April 5th? So I went back and looked at the dates of the proxy and the record date for each of the past 4 years. And what you see is the record date is quite consistent across years. It was actually about 2 weeks later in 2018 than it was in prior years. So yeah, did Nelson know for sure? Probably not. But did he really think that it was a lot later than April 5th? I would argue probably not. Just to get a little bit more sense, they just chose 2 random companies. It did not look systematically, so this could be a coincidence. But I looked at Microsoft and Ford, and for these 2 companies, the record date is quite consistent across years. So here's the thing, though, that's really interesting, is that the authors report an average difference of 24 days year to year in the record dates. I picked 2 firms at random, so maybe I picked non-representative firms, or maybe their average is driven by outliers. What I kind of guessing is that the outliers are really the interesting cases to focus on. I think that's where the action is and where we might be able to really learn something. Okay, so in summary, my first comment, the DuPont example, the authors focus on these negative abnormal returns after the ex-vote date, but there's a lot of other stuff going on at that same time. The AmTrust example, the authors focus on the fact that the record date was not publicly available ahead of time, but it seems unlikely that Icahn was really surprised by that. And broader evidence, there's less evidence of management hiding the record date, i.e. not disclosing it ahead of time, in cases where management would have the greatest incentives to hide it in special meetings, more contentious ones, et cetera. So my suggestion is going to be focus on cases where strategic behavior appears most likely. It might be a small subset, but I think those are going to be the interesting cases. Okay, let's go on to comment number 2, the NYSE sale of the record date information. So NYSE sells this expensive package of information to investors that includes the record date. Inconsistent with Reg FD, clearly. It raises all kinds of questions, right? How valuable is this information advantage? What else is included in this package? Is the record date one of the key pieces of information they're purchasing? And is the record date available from other sources? In 81% of shareholder meetings, the authors show that the exchange sale of this information precedes the record date, and it precedes the proxy where the record date is generally disclosed. Doesn't seem like a good thing. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to say relates to the prior comment. Yes, this is the case in 81% of all shareholder meetings, but it's only the case in 49% of cases within the special meeting sample. If we think about what types of cases are these most egregious scenarios more common? So where an egregious scenario would be the exchange sale of information precedes the record date, we see that's less common in special meetings. Exchange sale of information precedes the proxy date, again, less common in special meetings. I would argue if the NYSE sale was really designed to give certain investors an advantage, we would expect the opposite here. The other thing that's a little bit puzzling, so Slava talked about the turnover pattern. So here we see this big jump in turnover right after the record date. This is the full sample, including NYSE firms where the record date can be purchased. Interestingly, we see the same exact pattern in NASDAQ firms where the record date cannot be purchased. So the fact that it's similar within both samples suggests that NYSE is probably not the primary source of this information. I Googled a bit and found a number of cases. Visa, Salem Media, Sandal, these are all cases where the record date is pre-reported in the popular press. Maybe I just happen to find some non-representative ones, but again, it seems like it might be important. So in sum, we have clear violations of Reg FD, but the information is less available through NYSE in the more contentious cases, and evidence seems to suggest the investors learn of the record date elsewhere. Again, my suggestion is focus on the cases where these violations of Reg FD matter the most, even if it's a smaller subsample. I'm quite sure that there are some cases that are really alarming here, and I think we could learn a lot from those. Okay, Faye's going to cut me off. Let me just say 2 things super quickly. The authors find this big surge in trading volume. They often also document negative returns. What's a little bit odd is the volume happens after the record date. The negative abnormal returns happen before the record date. I couldn't quite figure out how those 2 things went together. A little bit more explanation. And then finally, in the last part of the paper, they relate things to voting outcomes. They have a number of regressions. They have relatively few controls, no or few fixed effects. What I really want to know is whether the timing of the record date disclosure has a causal impact on voting outcomes. Anything you can do to tighten specification in that direction would be great. So my broad takeaway, the fact that the X vote day is not publicly disclosed, I was fascinated by it. Combined with some shareholders purchasing the information ahead of time in ways that aren't consistent with Reg FD, clearly something important for us all to learn. I'd like to know how material that lack of equal information is. And what I'd like to know more about regarding the disclosure of the record date is how often does it really matter? How often is management really acting strategically? And does it affect votes? So thank you very much. I really enjoyed reading the paper. I learned a lot.
Thank you, Michelle, for great discussion. Slava, do you have about a minute to respond to Michelle? And then we'll open up to a Q&A.
Yeah, so let me take just a minute, and then Cliff is also here if he wants to add something. Michelle, thanks so much for really great discussion. It really shows clearly what we need to kind of push forward in the paper. Only 2 comments that I want to make. By saying that management is strategic, we don't necessarily mean that they always want to hide information. What we are saying that we live now in the environment where then all decision rights about the disclosure of this information, it belongs to management. belong to management, and it's not clear why we are there. I think sometimes management wants to disclose it early enough to influence shareholder base. Probably sometimes they want to delay it. We agree with you. We need to dig deeper into understanding what is strategic. The last comment that I'm making about the Amtrust case and whether people can learn it from other sources. Actually, in Amtrust case, it was really interesting because the company filed preliminary proxy statement after the record date, and they left the record date empty. They just hide that information. It happened after the record date. So I can probably looked at that proxy statement. He saw it's non-determined, and the inference probably what he made was it's going to happen soon, but it hasn't happened yet. Thanks again for really good suggestions.
Could I add one thing in here? Thank you, Michelle, for a set of great comments. The one point, you made a lot of great points, but I think an important one is that the outliers are probably important. And one thing we came to the conclusion is that most shareholder votes are perfunctory. They really don't matter. But it's those outliers that are really crucial for corporate governance and for understanding. So not all shareholder votes are created equal. And that's something that, I think subsequent papers may address as well. But thank you very much for your comments.
Yeah, absolutely. Enjoyed reading the paper. Thank you both.
Thank you, Slava. Thank you, Cliff. Let me go to a couple of questions from the audience. Well, there's actually both of them are by Fabrizio Ferri. And his first question is, perhaps proxy filings are typically after the record date because firms don't know how to mail the proxy, don't know who to mail the proxy to, unless they have the list of shareholders of record. So maybe it's non-malicious. Also, for regular meetings, the approximate record date should be predictable with a relatively good accuracy.
Yeah, so let me just mention one point in response to that. And Michelle also was asking about this predictability of the record date. We actually did look at that. And we agree that if you look at regular shareholder meetings without anything controversial involved, you can more or less predict within interval of several weeks when the record date is going to happen. But as Michelle and Cliff were saying, most interesting cases are special. And if you think about, for example, Amtrust case, it was a special shareholder meeting, which by definition happens off schedule. So predicting these events is really hard in terms of timing it and knowing in advance when it is going to happen.
All right. Another question is from Nitzan Shilong. The question was, doesn't the NYSE service violate the insider trading rules, makes the exchange a tipper? I think that's something Michelle also kind of hinted at.
I actually talked to a leading securities lawyer about this, and he said that stock exchanges are not covered by Reg FD.
Okay.
But it would seem to violate the spirit of that. And as Michelle pointed out, that the New York Stock Exchange sells a lot of information, a lot. It's not just this. And we had never seen this identified, much less analyzed anywhere in the literature. And I think there's a lot of research and a lot of big questions out there about that.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the information, Cliff.